all the rationale for economic cooperation are actually weakening and corroding, whereas all the rationale for economic coercion and leveraging have been increasing and are being increasingly used. So to me, that is an indication of ties worsening.
Hello and welcome to Times Radio. I'm Arjuna Keshvani-Ham, and today we're speaking to Dr. Sidharth Raimedhi, a fellow at the Council for Strategic and Defence Research in New Delhi and a columnist for The Print. Sidharth, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, images of Modi, Xi, and Putin from the SCO summit so far seem to have provoked really strong reactions from the US. White House Trade Advisor Peter Navarro on Monday accused Modi of getting into bed with two of the biggest authoritarians in the world. Others in the US, however, have dismissed this gathering as performative. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, for example. Do you think the summit signifies a genuine shifting in global alliances, or is most of this performative?
I can sense why some in the US would say that it's just performative, let's not flinch, because we've had the Kazan summit as well last year, October. And even there, you had the three leaders walk side by side, and the photo ops from there also were pretty impressive, right? But of course, relations did not necessarily improve following that. If anything, the Indian Army spokespersons have been detailing how China had helped Pakistan during the latest Indo-Pakistan 3-day conflict in May, right? So if relations had actually improved, then we would not have seen such a surprise where Chinese seeming involvement and assistance seem to have acquired a new threshold of participation, right? And also on the economic front, China has been using export controls pretty generously and quite deliberately, I would say, vis-a-vis India, right? In order to force India towards various shifts in its own economic policy towards China, as well as for strategic reasons, because China doesn't want to facilitate transfer of key tech from China to a potential rival or an actual rival now and in future. And hence these are the reasons why I can understand why many in the US would dismiss this as performative. But the same reasons also do suggest that the main substance of India-China relations, there is a story there. And the SCO summit might just be the cherry on top of the cake. So it's bright and it draws your attention. But the cake itself is undergoing significant shifts. And hence the idea that India and China will remain very, very opposed. They will have a competitive relationship, both economically and strategically. That could change over the coming years, not because India has suddenly, because there's been a growing trust or there has been a growing understanding. There has not been either of these, right? But only because opposition to China across various fronts, economic, military, strategic, diplomatic, is likely to get more and more difficult and costly and risky, right? And hence, the SEO summit is performative because it also comes in the shadow of Trump's tariff and economic coercion of India. But at the same time, it also provides, I think, a window to US observers and an opportunity to more fully understand the underlying dynamic, which is actually changing quite rapidly from season to season or month to month.
And we've talked a lot about India and China here. How does Russia play into this dynamic?
So even here, the most specific, concrete example of the dynamic is that the US has imposed additional 25% tariff on India, and for the sole reason that it has been buying Russian energy supplies, right? So the way I see it is that, of course, it is in Russia's interest that India keeps buying, and Russia has also publicly generously offered some form of a discount. It's also in China's interest that this continues because China sees India as a front line on this issue. Because if India buckles under pressure, then the pressure on China is likely to increase from the US to also curtail its purchase of Russian oil. And hence, there is a very momentary but strong convergence of interest between the three powers. So that is the odd part, which is that it has been well known for decades that India sees its future tied more with the West in terms of economics, trade, technology, strategic alignment, right? But it just so happens that on this one issue, energy security and our purchase of Russia, this one issue has kind of made us kindred spirit friends with Russia and China. So that's a risk in the sense that if the West also overemphasizes this one convergence with Russia, this could play into the hands of both Putin and Xi Jinping because then the West or the US has left India with no other choice but to converge more broadly based on this one narrower interest area. So this in a way also goes back to the previous question about performative, that even the photo ops, yeah, we can call it photo ops, but they also have a political import, right? For instance, Modi and Putin's photographs from the car, from inside the car, the way they warmly greeted each other, that is signaling, right? And the fact that all that has happened and that has been projected in a certain way, it does mean that India has signaled that it's not likely to curtail its import of Russian energy because you cannot have such warm display of affection and trust at the SCO with President Putin and tomorrow curtail the purchase, which will be seen as a personal affront possibly to
Yeah.
President Putin.
And today, China's been staging a huge show of force with a grand military parade, as you said, marking 80 years since China's victory over Japan in World War II. This is clearly a show of unity against the West. And quite conspicuously, I think Modi is not in attendance there. What do you think the significance of that is, if any?
Yeah, I think that's very quite significant. And there are three data points on this. One is that one also must remember that before Modi landed in China, he did make a stop in Japan. And that was also discussed very widely in Chinese strategic circles and media as well. Because whereas the SEO produced a lot of pictures, a lot of grandeur, it was in Japan that they had more substantive agreements on very key issues, be it critical minerals, resilience, defense cooperation, and all that, right? So it was an indication to Beijing and perhaps to others as well that regardless of the present moment and regardless of the SCO summit, that India is still tied in its hopes and in its future investments with the West, Japan here being considered as part of the West. And hence, it does feed into the idea that indeed was short term. The other indication is that the Russians have been promoting this framework called Russia, India, China trilateral, something that had first come up in 1996. Back then, it was intended to push back against US unipolarity on various issues. So now Russia is the most enthusiastic. China, I think, closely following behind Russia. And India is a bit of an outlier here as well. India is not very comfortable with this framework, and hence we've almost tacitly denied that we are very interested. Our MEA statement suggested that we are not very keen on it. So that indicates the limits to even the symbolic diplomatic grand alliance, right? So we are not likely to join the RIC, and similarly, not attending. I think Prime Minister Modi was invited, but he decided not to attend the parade. Again, shows a limit. Especially, this is an issue which is very important to Japan because a lot of the parade is basically aimed primarily at Japan in terms of the historical interpretation of it. And the military weapons and its display is, of course, aimed more at the US and regarding a Taiwan contingency, right? And hence, Prime Minister Modi and India choosing to not participate in that does kind of signal that despite short-term exigencies and pressure, and immense pressure from the Trump administration and some public humiliation, we are not like making rash decisions and leaning into the arms of this this authoritarian triad of North Korea, China, and Russia.
And this parade is obviously a show of Chinese military force and a showcasing of Chinese weaponry. This display of prowess, I think, is significant also in the context of the heightened military tensions in the region, the recent clashes with neighbors in the South China Sea, and obviously, as you mentioned, the 4-day India-Pakistan escalation back in May, Operation Sindoor, a conflict which arguably, at least for the domestic Chinese population, became a real-world testing ground for the showcasing of Chinese weaponry, which was utilized by Pakistan against India. Broadly, is this Chinese weaponry that we've seen on display today something that the US and India should start worrying about?
I think the main thrust of the weapons that have been displayed, they still fall within the framework of A to AD vis-a-vis the US. So they are, for instance, undersea drones, the extra large undersea drones, the anti-ship missiles, then air defense laser directed energy weapons. So they are both of obviously demonstrating the achievements of the Chinese defense industrial base, which we've known to be quite impressive, especially last few years. The parade does not, I don't think it significantly shifts existing understanding of the strength and capabilities of the Chinese military. Neither does it necessarily, as of now, and I will myself be relying mostly on experts who are keen observers of Chinese military weapons. Until now, in a sense, it is relatively status quo-ist in terms of the projection of the weapons. These are within the framework of the strategic objectives. These are individual projects and weapons which have been long in gestation. So I don't think it leads to a key shift militarily. That I don't think there's been a huge surprise there. But the diplomatic part of it, the attendance of Kim Jong-un, and especially Kim Jong-un, I would say, even more than Putin, is quite remarkable, especially from a Western perspective also. We know that President Trump is very keen towards continuing an attempt at rapprochement with Kim Jong-un. Um, and the fact that and his own improving relations with Russia over the last year or two, it has been seen as a complicating factor within the triangle of Russia, China, North Korea, because maybe it was thought that Russia and North Korea are getting closer at Beijing's expense. The second thing is that it was again kind of inferred and assumed that China would like to have a very standoff approach to any new negotiations over the Korean Peninsula, because the China had felt back in 2018 that it was betrayed by America, right? Because America roped in China to apply maximum pressure on North Korea and then had its own bilateral without adequately informing China. So, but this gathering of the three leaders does show that consistent with the momentum of greater flexible cooperation amongst authoritarian states and leaders, that they have become better at dealing with the cracks, at addressing some of the mistrust. And hence the forever idea that a lot of Western analysts may have of drawing wedges between China and Russia, then China and North Korea. The West may be losing its ability to do that more and more for many reasons, and also a lot of that having to do with President Trump's second administration, because the attack on Iran is a reference point here. The fact that American presidents can have an agreement and then go back on it when a different administration comes up. And hence, the calculation between all three leaders is that it pays more and it's wiser to stand close to each other, rather than try to have your own deal with the US at the expense of the other, right? So that's, I think, the more remarkable, slightly surprising part about the military.
In that context, I'm also really interested in the question of how China is consolidating its position in South Asia, bringing potentially Bangladesh too under its wing. Just a week before the SCO, we saw a trilateral meeting between top-level diplomats in China, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Chinese diplomats. Could you speak a bit more about what you thought of that meeting?
No, it is certainly significant. So India, Bangladesh have had good relations until last year when Sheikh Hasina lost power due to rising protests and dissatisfaction, right? And ever since then, there has been highly radioactive domestic, regional issues, emotive issues regarding history, regarding communalism and identity that has plagued India-Bangladesh relations. It has also moved into areas of securitization. There is growing talk in both countries of future military contingencies potentially, which has never happened in a long, at least for decades, between India and Bangladesh. So, and also there's some element of economic coercion and punishment vis-a-vis each other. So, and this, of course, is fertile ground for China to assure Bangladesh, to draw it closer to Bangladesh. Not that they did not have close relations even prior to this, but I think so. China has traditionally been relatively measured, cautious in its expansion of influence in South Asia. But I feel over the last 1 year, may have been an assessment in Beijing that we can afford to implement a slight shift towards more brazen attempts at isolating India within South Asia, at facilitating that, like you mentioned, a trilateral between Pakistan, Bangladesh, and China. 10 years ago, this would have been dismissed, I think, in China as a wise idea because relations with India was more important, there was a sense that no need to provoke India and make it feel like it's under siege, right? The string of pearls theory, which India had nurtured for decades, Chinese would try to convince them time and again that there is no such conspiracy against you. But hosting a trilateral does indicate that Beijing's felt need to assure India on that front has declined substantively. Now Beijing feels that we can get more out of India not through positive assurance, but through negative leverages and coercion and threat. And we have enough political, diplomatic, economic capitals and military, because Bangladesh military mainly buys weapons from China. So we have enough of that now to knock India down a few notches, basically, right?
In a recent article, you also argue that India's strategic vulnerability to the US and presumably also to China is unprecedented. Could you explain a bit how we've gotten or how India has gotten to that point?
I did write an article for the print a month ago called "How India Lost Its Geopolitical Sweet Spot." Um, but the very short version of that is that India's sweet spot did emerge from around the year 2000, 2001. And it emerged with the bet that America had made on India, which is that the India has just tested its nuclear weapons. It has shown the technological capability to do that. It has instituted economic reforms finally after decades of American advice, neoliberal advice, right? And it's seeing significant growth rates. And hence, it's better to be friends with India now and also on generous terms from us, which is America, and then befriend a future growing power, especially when there is this Chinese behemoth that's likely to grow even faster and become even more dominant in Asia. So this meant that it was in US's interest to be nice to India, to put it simply. And the more US tried to woo India to align itself to the US, the more China took note of it. And China did not want a closer India, US, Japan alignment. And hence it incentivized even China to reassure India more, to try to address the security dilemma at the border, despite its attempts at encroachment occasionally here and there, right? So that and Then there's a Russia leg of it as well, which is that even Russia's predisposition towards China was more wary throughout the 2000s and 2010s than it's now. There was many strategic circles within Russia which had thought that we need to manage China's rise in a more realpolitik manner. And India was a valued partner in that vision because we are, two significant land masses in Asia, and China is in. And that was the logic of Cold War alliance between US and Soviet Union anyway, right? So because of these reasons, and they are all interrelated, Russia, China, US, that India had a sweet spot based on which it could bargain and negotiate from a position of strength, not based necessarily on its present levels of military or economic power, but based on the idea that India is getting there and will get there with time. I think a number of reasons starting from 2020 has started to reverse that trend line. First is the Galwan impasse and standoff. That had limited India's ability to engage in external balancing vis-a-vis China in the Indo-Pacific, in the broader Asian area, because our focus then was on maintaining peace and tranquility at the border. So our China policy became more and more beholden to making sure there is no military escalation at the border. Um, then there has been a growing sort of assessment of India's economic and technological inertias, lack of reforms, and this and that. So this is a domestic economic picture. And now, whereas India was hailed in Davos World Economic Forum as the next star, now most conversation, and if you go to any think tank report or financial report, you would see that the consensus is skeptical towards India's present and future economic trajectory, despite many gains and advancements, right? And hence the US no longer sees India as a strategic partner which is likely to significantly align with US. So in a sense, it's an accounting problem, right? We have invested so much in it. We are still not getting what all we wanted, and Russia-Ukraine war was one of the major asks. And when are we going to get dividends out of it? And the more India reasserted its strategic autonomy and made it its identity that this is me and I will never align more significantly than this, the more US senators and analysts and officials started to come around to the idea that, okay, maybe it was our naivete that we thought India US is like meant to be strategic partners. So that led to a new realism in US as well, right? And not to take too long, but yeah, even Operation Sindoor plays a role. The assessment in many Western and Chinese and Russian circles has been that India's future now is tied back with Pakistan again. So this Operation Sindoor may have unlocked the revival of the India-Pakistan military rivalry and dynamic, right? And hence, the more now India is focused on Pakistan, who is now being aided and assisted by China, the less it will be able to stand up to China in any case, be it in the South China Sea or in the Himalayas. So these are the reasons why I had argued back then that India's geopolitical sweet spot has in a way faded. The only key question is that are we going to try to get it back somehow, or are we going to adjust to this new reality? I've been prescribing that we should adjust to this new reality and focus a little bit more on economic reforms, defense procurement reforms, a more flexible form of diplomacy vis-a-vis our neighbors and with China as well. Sort of a buy time, hide your capabilities kind of a strategic approach, but of course with some caveats because the world does not stand still.
And in a recent article, you argued that, contrary to popular opinion, and in spite of Trump's 50% tariffs on India, the India China bilateral relationship has actually shown no signs of improvement and arguably has even deteriorated under what is apparently a calmer surface. Can you explain exactly how came to this apparently controversial conclusion?
I think the way I came to this conclusion is that maybe it's a two-step process. The first is to examine the perceived signs of progress, which everyone takes for granted, and then infers a linear progression of improvement, right? Even the resumption of flights, visas, the pilgrimage, the border trade, even if that is fully restored, it's still not. That does not indicate that strategic ties are improving because those features were in place even in 2019 before Galwan. And no one was saying that because they exist, India-China relations are either good or improving, right? These are the bare minimum of exchange that two neighborly countries should have, could have. And it's good that we are going back there, perhaps, right? So a lot of the positivity is inferred from those things. It's just that I think that those are not big things. They do not indicate improvement in strategic ties. That's number one. Secondly, the economic story has clearly and been one of coercion and leverage over the last 1 year. starting from the tunnel boring machines that China had stopped Germany from exporting to India, then to the agricultural sector, fertilizers. Now there was some respite because perhaps because of the SEO and some of the controls were loosened and India started receiving more of fertilizers. But recent reports again suggest that the same strict controls are coming back starting from October with potentially more direct consequences based on a crop rotation, right? And hence, to anyone else who's, let's say, not been reading the headlines, not been reading the big picture analysis, they will look at this and their first obvious common sense inference will be that its ties are worsening. And on the economic front, it could have been positive. For decades, there was this idea that India, China have complementarities, which they do. One needs investment, the other has surplus investment, infrastructure, surplus infrastructure, and all of that. But China's own perception of India as a potential strategic rival has somehow even hardened. And so the sensitivities around tech transfer towards establishing a vibrant manufacturing supply chain base in India, all of that has increased. And in recent months, we've also heard about how China is worried about losing its low tech, low value added manufacturing. It wants to avoid repeating the mistakes of the West, right? Where it offshored even the low tech manufacturing to foreign countries. China now thinks that they need to retain that for strategic reasons in the future. And hence, all the rationale for economic cooperation are actually weakening and corroding, whereas all the rationale for economic coercion and leveraging have been increasing and are being increasingly used. So to me, that is an indication of ties worsening. But the same, and military is another story. I will not go into that now, but I'm just giving you two, three examples here. But the problem is that the more ties are decreasing at a substantive level, the more need there is for both countries to use politics and signaling and diplomacy to mitigate against that, to present a more conciliatory image of it, right? Because it's a very important relationship, and maintenance of peace and tranquility is being prioritized all across. So the worse it gets, perhaps, the more reasons for leaders and governments to pretend as if that relations are being managed, we can work it out. Because to acknowledge that it's nosediving that way could lead to worsening of trends.
Okay, you've spoken a bit there about reshoring of manufacturing away from China to India, for example, with the Make India policy. First of all, do you see these efforts to make India an appealing hub for global value chains as something that's likely to be successful? And do you think that this offshoring of manufacturing away from China is something that is aggravating China at all?
I'll start from the last one, which is has it aggravated China's concerns? I think it broadly has, and more specifically, especially in the electronic sector. The example of Apple within a few years being able to ship off 20% of its production from India, from one place in Chennai, is seen alarmingly, is seen as a potential foreshadowing of a future where India does emerge as a potential real-term rival to China. Now, if I was a Chinese official, that I would be worried about because a lot of my leverage, diplomatic, strategic vis-a-vis Europe, Canada, Japan, you name it, comes from the fact that I've monopolized a lot of manufacturing capabilities, right? But if India emerges as a hub where the manufacturing takes off, then purchasing power increases, so it becomes a very attractive export market, the way China used to be until recently, perhaps even now. So all of that will significantly take away from China a lot of its power, right? And that will actually lead to a greater balance in Asia. So, in a certain sense, in a liberal sense, then the Asian century becomes more balanced and more multipolar, equitable, and all of that. Now, I don't, as a realist, I don't think China wants that. And hence, China is increasingly sensitive to the prospect of India emerging as a manufacturing hub. And hence, Chinese online opinion, especially nationalist digital opinion, is quite critical of even conciliatory gestures at times from China towards India. And I do believe that the CPC is quite sensitive to how the nationalist media is perceiving things. And so these are the reasons why the future China-India economic cooperation will have to go through this problem. And I think it's a big problem, right? Secondly, India's efforts at making India to become a manufacturing hub. I think it's safe to say, and it's quite a consensus, that it has been not as satisfactory as was hoped and expected 10 years back. And there has been some acknowledgement of it even within the government. If you look at the economic survey report 2024 and 2025, it's quite an interesting report. It's quite honest. It's quite refreshing to see actually, and it does acknowledge some of that. You also see it in our finance minister's rebuke of India Inc. of private industry. India had implemented very generous tax cuts for private industry in 2018, and it's a whole range of subsidies of various. But Indian industry investment within India has been declining quite dramatically over the last few years. So, and hence she once asked them, explain to me why you are not investing in India to them. And I don't think there was an answer to that. If an answer was given behind private doors, I don't know. But and hence there is much more reckoning with our economic grand strategy, internal and architecture, or last 1 month or two, I would say, many signs of it, including officials and former officials, then since 2014. So Prime Minister Modi himself has had to say that there is a 100-day reform agenda program and all of that. So but the thing is that that is the biggest, that's the most important debate that's going on, I think. And and it'll intersect very strongly with the China question. And the question will be raised, does China hold the answer to India's manufacturing woes? And there have been reports of many of our top conglomerates traveling to China, eager to have joint projects and joint ventures with Chinese companies because they are relying on imports of key tech and components, right? So I do think that that is one of the factors that will be pushing India towards more pragmatic ties with China as well.